They thought your silence meant you didn't see what was happening, that your calm presence was a sign of innocence or even a lack of awareness. In their mind, you were the easy one to read, the one who wouldn't question, the one who would simply accept whatever version of reality they chose to present. But what they failed to understand is that silence is not emptiness, it is attention. And while they were busy creating distance, sending mixed signals or carefully controlling how much of themselves they revealed, you were watching. Not reacting doesn't mean not noticing. It means choosing to understand before choosing to respond. You noticed the pauses in their voice when something didn't align. You saw the subtle shift in their energy when they were pulling away, even if their words tried to say otherwise. You picked up on the patterns the way they came close when it suited them and disappeared when things became too real. None of this was invisible to you. You simply didn't rush to call it out because you understood something most people don't. People reveal who they are over time, not in moments. And you were willing to give that time, not out of naivety, but out of awareness. They assumed that if you weren't reacting, you weren't affected. That if you weren't questioning them, you believed everything they said. But in truth, you were measuring consistency. You were watching actions, not just listening to words. You were paying attention to what they did when they thought no one was analyzing them. And in that space where they felt most comfortable underestimating you, they became the most honest version of themselves. Not because they chose to be honest, but because they stopped trying so hard to hide. There's a quiet strength in observing without immediately responding. It requires patience, control, and a deep sense of self. You didn't feel the need to prove that you understood. You didn't interrupt the process just to make a point. Instead, you allowed things to unfold naturally, knowing that clarity comes with time. And as everything unfolded, you started to see the full picture, not just the version they showed you, but the version they couldn't hide. What they didn't realize is that underestimating someone gives that person the greatest advantage. Because while they believed they were in control of the narrative, you were collecting the truth pie, each by piece. Every inconsistency, every emotional withdrawal, every moment of distance, it all added up. And you didn't need to confront them at every step because you were building something more powerful than an argument. You were building understanding. And understanding changes everything. It shifts your perspective. It removes confusion. It replaces doubt with clarity. You stopped asking yourself, what are they doing? And started recognizing this is who they are. That shift is quiet, but it's transformative. Because once you see someone clearly, you no longer chase explanations. You no longer need reassurance. You simply know. They thought your silence gave them space to control the situation, but in reality, it gave you space to see it for what it truly was. And that's the moment everything begins to change. Not outwardly at first, but internally. You start detaching not out of anger, but out of understanding. You stop investing the same energy, not because you don't care, but because you see the limits of what they can offer. And while they're still operating under the assumption that you're unaware, you're already moving differently. That's the part they never experiment, etc. The quiet shift. The moment where your energy changes, your responses become shorter. Your presence feels different. They can sense it, but they don't fully understand it because in their mind, you were never supposed to see this clearly. You were supposed to stay in that role they created for you. But you were never that person. You were simply observing the whole time, waiting until the truth revealed itself without force. And when it finally does, there's no need for confrontation, no need for dramatic endings. Because by then, you've already reached a place they didn't think you could reach. A place of clarity, of control, of quiet power. The kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself because it's already made its decision. While they were busy playing their role, pulling away, coming close, testing boundaries, and controlling how much of themselves you were allowed to see, you were doing something far more powerful. You were observing, not reacting, not chasing, not forcing clarity where it didn't naturally exist. And they mistook that for weakness. They assumed that because you didn't immediately respond to every inconsistency, you didn't recognize it. But observe. Vibration is not passive. It is one of the most controlled and intentional states a person can choose. Anyone can react. Anyone can get emotional, confront, question, demand answers in the moment. That's easy. It's instinctive, but it takes discipline to hold back, to step outside the emotional pull of a situation and simply watch it unfold. That's what you were doing. You weren't ignoring what was happening, you were studying it. You were allowing patterns to reveal themselves fully, without interrupting the process just to satisfy a temporary feeling. They didn't understand that every time they created distance, you noticed the timing. Every time they returned, you noticed the reason. You saw the rhythm in their behavior, the cycle they kept repeating, even when they thought they were being unpredictable. And instead of reacting to each moment individually, You connected them. You turned scattered actions into a clear pattern. That's not weakness. That's strategy. There's a kind of power in staying grounded while someone else is inconsistent. It means you are not being controlled by their shifts. It means their silence doesn't create panic in you. Their presence doesn't create depth in density, and their absence doesn't create confusion. You remain steady, not because you don't care, but because you refuse to lose clarity. And clarity requires space. It requires you to step back enough to see the full picture instead of getting lost in individual moments. They thought they had the upper hand because they were controlling the pace. But what they didn't realize is that control over timing doesn't equal control over perception. While they were deciding when to show up and when to disappear, you were deciding what it all meant. And meaning is where the real power lies. Because once you understand the meaning behind someone's actions, you are no longer influenced by the surface of what they do. You didn't rush to label their behavior. You didn't jump to conclusions based on one or two experiences. You allowed consistency or inconsistency to define them. And that patience gave you something most people never gain: accuracy. You saw them as they truly are, not as they tried to present themselves. And when you see someone clearly, you stop negotiating with confusion. They may have believed that your calmness meant you were easy to manipulate, that your lack of immediacy. The reaction meant you could be led in any direction. But the truth is, people who observe deeply are the hardest to control, because they don't move based on impulse. They move based on understanding. And understanding cannot be easily shaken. There's also a quiet confidence in choosing not to react. It shows that you are not desperate for answers, not dependent on immediate reassurance, not driven by fear of losing someone. Instead, you trust your ability to read the situation over time. You trust that truth will reveal itself without you having to force it. And that kind of trust within yourself is something they didn't expect. While they were focused on managing appearances, you were focused on reality. While they were thinking short-term how to maintain distance, how to avoid vulnerability, you were thinking long-term, seeing where all of this was leading. And that difference in perspective is what separates reaction from strategy. Eventually, all the small details you noticed began to form a complete picture. The mixed signals weren't confusing anymore. The emotional distance wasn't random. It all made sense. And once it made sense, your energy shifted. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, controlled way. You stopped investing in uncertainty. You stopped giving the benefit of the doubt where it was no longer deserved. Not because you were hurt, but because you understood. That's what they failed to see from the beginning. Your silence wasn't empty. It was full of awareness. Your patience wasn't passive. It was intentional. And your lack of reaction wasn't a sign that you didn't understand it, was proof that you understood more than they ever expected. They felt safe around you in a way that slowly turned into carelessness. Because in their mind, you were someone who wouldn't question too deeply, someone who would accept inconsistencies, someone who would fill in the gaps with assumptions instead of demanding clarity. That belief created a false sense of control in them. They started to think the dynamic was one-sided, that they were managing the distance, setting the pace, and deciding what level of connection you were allowed to experience. But what they didn't realize is that underestimation always comes with a cost. When someone believes they are not being fully seen, they relax their guard. They stop performing as carefully. They stop monitoring, eyeing every word and every reaction. And slowly, the real patterns begin to appear. That's what happened here. The moment they assumed you wouldn't notice, they started showing more of who they actually are. Not intentionally at first, but naturally. Because when people feel unchallenged, they reveal their unfiltered behavior. They didn't see that you were not reacting because you were overwhelmed, you were not reacting because you were observing. And that observation created space for them to expose themselves. Every small inconsistency they thought would go unnoticed added to your understanding. Every emotional withdrawal they believed would be ignored became a data point in your awareness. They thought silence meant agreement, but in your case, silence meant analysis. The danger of being underestimated is not that it makes you powerless, but that it makes others careless. And carelessness always leaves traces. They started to repeat patterns more openly, assuming there would be no consequence, no confrontation, no deeper reading of their behavior. They became comfortable in the illusion that you were not fully aware of what was happening beneath the surface. That comfort lowered their discipline. And while they were relaxing into that assumption, you were becoming more precise in your understanding. You weren't rushing to conclusions, but you were no longer ignoring the pattern either. You began to see the rhythm in their behavior, the way they would engage intensely for a short time, then pull away without explanation. the way they would reappear as if nothing had changed, the way emotional presence was never consistent, only conditional. They believed that because you didn't immediately challenge these patterns, you didn't recognize them. But recognition doesn't always need confrontation. Sometimes, recognition is internal. It's the moment you stop confusing inconsistency with complexity. It's the moment you stop trying to decode intentions and start observing behavior as it is, without distortion. Their sense of safety around you turned into the very thing that exposed them. Because when people stop trying to manage how they are perceived, their real nature becomes visible. And what they didn't realize is that you were never confused, you were patient. And patience in observation is not tolerance. It is gathering clarity without interference. Over time, that false sense of control they had over the dynamic began to collapse. Because control built on misunderstanding always collapses once understanding arrives. You started noticing not just what they did, but what they avoided. Not just when they showed up, but when they chose to disappear. And those absences started speaking louder than their presence. They underestimated the fact that you were forming conclusions without needing to announce them. You didn't need to argue to validate your awareness. You didn't need to question every behavior to confirm what you already understood. You simply watched, and in watching, you learned everything you needed. What they thought was emotional advantage or calmness, your patience, your lack of reaction was actually your strongest position. Because while they were acting under the assumption of invisibility, you were documenting everything internally. And once a person becomes fully visible to your understanding, the illusion of control they hold no longer works on you. That's when the shift begins, quietly, without confrontation, without explanation. You stop engaging with the illusion and start responding only to reality. And by the time they realize that their carelessness has been seen through completely, the dynamic has already changed. Not because you forced it, but because their own underestimation created the space for truth to surface. What they never realized is that while they were busy managing distance, controlling emotional availability, and trying to keep things ambiguous, you were doing something far more precise. You were connecting patterns they assumed were invisible. To them, each moment stood alone. A delayed reply was just a delay. A sudden withdrawal was just space. A return after silence was just reconnection. But for you, nothing existed in isolation. Everything had context. Everything had weight. And slowly, without ever announcing it, you began to see the structure behind their behavior. Avoidant patterns are not random. They follow a rhythm approach: distance, return, repeat. But to recognize that rhythm, you cannot be emotionally entangled in every single moment. You have to step back far enough to see the cycle instead of the scene. And that's exactly what you were doing. You weren't reacting to each individual action like most people do. You were observing the repetition behind it. You were noticing how closeness always came with a pullback, how intimacy was always followed by withdrawal, how consistency was never sustained long enough to become secure. They believed their behavior was too subtle to be decoded. They thought as long as they didn't explain themselves, their patterns would remain ambiguous. But inconsistency always reveals itself to someone who is not trying to force meaning in the moment. You didn't rush to label them after a single event. You waited. You watched how similar situations repeated themselves over time. And repetition is what removes illusion. The first time it happens, you question. The second time you notice. The third time you start understanding. And after enough repetition, you stop asking, why is this happening? And start recognizing this is how it operates. That shift is where clarity begins. Because now you are no longer reacting emotionally to each occurrence, you are interpreting the system behind it. They didn't realize that your silence wasn't acceptance. It was mapping. You were building a mental structure of their behavior without interfering in it. You were not interrupting the process with emotional reaction. Ions that would cloud your judgment. Instead, you were allowing the full pattern to unfold so that nothing remained hidden. And in that space, everything they thought was unclear slowly became predictable. Avoidants often rely on ambiguity to maintain control. If nothing is defined, nothing can be challenged. If emotions are kept inconsistent, expectations remain low. But what they fail to understand is that ambiguity only works on those who are emotionally reactive in real time. It does not work on someone who observes over time, because over time ambiguity becomes pattern, and pattern becomes understanding. You started noticing how their presence always came in waves. Intensity followed by withdrawal. Warmth followed by distance. Engagement followed by silence. At first it may have felt confusing, but you didn't allow confusion to become reaction. Instead, you stored the information. You observed how predictable their unpredictability actually was. They thought they were keeping you uncertain, but in reality, they were revealing a system you were slowly decoding. And once you see the system, you are no longer affected by individual fluctuations within it. A distant message in no longer confuses you. A sudden return no longer overwhelms you, because now you understand it is not about you, it is about their cycle. That realization is what changes everything, because you stop personalizing behavior that was never stable to begin with. You stop filling gaps with hope or doubt. You stop interpreting inconsistency as complexity. Instead, you start seeing it as structure repeating itself. And once you see structure, emotional confusion dissolves. You no longer chase clarity from them because you already have clarity within yourself. You already understand what is likely to happen next, not because you are guessing, but because you are observing a pattern that has already shown itself multiple times. They assumed you were just going along with things, absorbing whatever was given, not fully grasping what was happening. But what they didn't realize is that understanding doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it is built quietly through repetition, patience, and attention to detail. And by the time they thought they were still operating in uncertainty with you, you had already stepped outside the cycle and started seeing it from above. They often miss. Read patience as tolerance, as if staying calm in the face of inconsistency meant you were willing to accept anything. But what they failed to understand is that patience, when combined with awareness, is not passive at all. It is selective. It is deliberate. It is the space where you are not reacting emotionally, but evaluating quietly. And in that space, you are not lowering your standards, you were measuring them. To them, your lack of immediate reaction looked like acceptance. When they withdrew without explanation and you didn't chase, they assumed it didn't affect you. When they returned as if nothing had happened and you didn't question it immediately, they assumed you had moved on too quickly or didn't notice the gap. But in reality, you noticed everything. You simply didn't feel the need to interrupt your own clarity just to respond to their inconsistency in real time. Patience, in your case, was not about enduring confusion. It was about refusing to let confusion dictate your behavior. You were watching how they behaved when there were no consequences, when there was no immediate emotional feedback, when they felt free to act without explanation. And that version of the unfiltered, unaccounted version was far more revealing than anything they tried to present in moments of closeness. They thought patience meant you were emotionally available no matter what they did. But what they didn't realize is that patience has limits when it is grounded in awareness. You don't rush to conclusions, but you also don't ignore patterns that repeat themselves. You allow time to reveal intention, but you also allow time to expose inconsistency. And once inconsistency becomes clear, patience stops being openness and starts becoming evaluation. There is a difference between waiting blindly and waiting consciously. Blind waiting hopes that things will change. Conscious waiting observes whether they do. And you are not hoping, you were observing. You were not filling gaps with assumptions, you were watching what they chose to do with those gaps. And that distinction is everything. Every time they pulled away, your silence was not confusion. It was data collection. Every time they returned without acknowledgement of their absence, your calmness was not forgiveness. It was assessment. You were not reacting to the emotional surface of their behavior, you were looking at the structure beneath it. And that structure began to reveal a pattern that could no longer be ignored. They mistook your stillness for emotional flexibility. But stillness, when conscious, is not flexibility, it is restraint. It is the ability to hold back reaction until understanding is complete. And that is something they didn't account for, because they were used to emotional reactions filling the gaps quickly. They were used to people asking questions, seeking reassurance, trying to restore balance immediately. But you didn't rush to restore anything that was still unclear. And in that space, something shifted. The more you observed without reacting, the more visible their patterns became. The more visible their patterns became, the less emotional weight they held over you. Because once you start seeing behavior as predictable, it stops feeling personal. It stops triggering confusion. It stops demanding an emotional response. They thought your patience meant you were emotionally invested no matter what. But what they didn't see is that your patience was slowly turning into clarity. And clarity changes the entire dynamic. Because once you understand someone's limits, their unpredictability loses its emotional grip on you. You stop trying to interpret every shift as meaningful. You start recognizing it as repetition. And that's when your energy begins to change. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly. You no longer fill silence with questions. You no longer fill distance with assumptions. You no longer treat inconsistency as something you need to solve. Instead, you let it exist while you observe what it continues to reveal. They assumed your patience was a space where they could continue the same patterns without consequence. But in reality, it was a space where those patterns were being fully seen without interruption. And once something is fully seen, it cannot continue to hold the same illusion of control. So by the time they thought your patience meant they still had unlimited access to your understanding, you had already begun to limit what you were willing to emotionally invest in. Not because of anger, but because of clarity. And that clarity didn't need to be announced, it simply changed how you responded, how you engaged, and ultimately, how much of yourself you allowed to remain available. By the time they finally start to understand, and what was really happening, it is already too late to undo the shift that has taken place. The realization doesn't come in a dramatic moment. It comes slowly, almost uncomfortably, as they begin to notice that your energy is no longer the same. The access they once assumed was always available is no longer there in the same way. The space they used to enter and exit freely now feels different. And that difference is what unsettles them the most. They thought your calm presence meant availability without limit. They assumed your patience meant continuity without boundaries. But what they didn't understand is that understanding someone deeply does not always lead to holding on, it often leads to stepping back. Because once clarity replaces confusion, emotional investment naturally changes shape. You no longer participate in uncertainty the same way, because you are no longer inside it. You are observing it from a distance. The realization hits them in fragments. First, they notice your responses are not as immediate. Then they notice your emotional engagement is not as deep. Then they notice your silence carries a different quality, not confusion, not waiting, but completion. And hat is what they cannot easily process. Because in their mind, silence was always something temporary, something they could eventually break, fill, or reset. But your silence now is different. It is not waiting for clarity anymore. It is coming from having already reached it. They begin to replay moments in their mind. The times they withdrew and you didn't chase. The times they returned and you didn't question the way they expected. The times they thought you were simply adjusting, when in reality you were absorbing information they didn't realize mattered. And slowly, the realization forms that you were not reacting because you were unsure, you were not reacting because you were already seeing the full picture. That understanding creates discomfort in them because it removes the illusion that they were in control of how much you knew. They thought absence created confusion for you, but it actually created clarity. They thought inconsistency kept you attached, but it actually revealed the limits of what they were offering. And now, as they look back, they begin to see that nothing was missed on your side. Everything was seen. Everything was registered. Everything was understood. In silence, long before it was ever acknowledged out loud. By the time they realize this, your emotional position has already shifted. You are no longer in the phase of interpretation. You are in the phase of conclusion. And conclusions don't require negotiation. They don't require explanation. They simply change how you move forward. That is what they fail to grasp in the beginning, that awareness doesn't always lead to confrontation, it often leads to detachment. They may try to reestablish the old dynamic. They may try to return with the same patterns, the same distance, the same half-presence they once used without consequence. But what they don't realize is that the version of you that responded to uncertainty in real time is no longer operating in that space. You are no longer trying to figure them out. You already have. And once someone is fully understood, the emotional urgency that once existed begins to dissolve. Not because you stopped caring instantly, but because care without clarity eventually transforms. It stops being attachment to uncertainty and becomes recognition of limitation. You start seeing what is possible and what is not, and you no longer invest energy into what repeatedly shows its boundaries. That is the part they never expected. Not anger, not confrontation, but absence of need. Because when someone finally realizes they were being observed instead of misunderstood, they also realize that their unpredictability never had the power they thought it did. It only worked while it was still being interpreted emotionally. Once it is understood logically and emotionally together, it loses its grip. So when they finally see it, they understand too late that you were never naive in the way they assumed. You were simply waiting long enough for truth to speak without interruption. And now that it has, there is nothing left for you to chase, nothing left for you to decode, and nothing left for them to hide behind. The realization does not change what happened. It only changes what they can no longer access.